Everyone thought the billionaire's daughter had come into the world utterly sightless. For many years, nobody doubted it, neither the physicians, nor the household employees, nor even her very own dad. She existed in quiet isolation, cut off from the outside, tucked away inside a grand estate brimming with hidden truths. Yet all that shifted the moment a fresh housekeeper joined the team. He wasn't a physician or an expert, merely an individual who observed closely. The subtle observation he made amid his unobtrusive duties throughout the residence would dismantle decades of deception. Confront a mighty lineage's history, expose a reality that had lain concealed ever since the young child entered the world. And the revelation he unearthed would stun all involved, particularly the gentleman who imagined he had spared no effort in safeguarding his sole offspring. Prior to proceeding with this tale, remember to sign up for the channel and give the video a thumbs up. Oh, and recall to leave a comment underneath indicating your viewing location. We adore hearing that Alexander Harrington was a formidable figure in the technology sector realm, renowned for amassing wealth via diligence and astute choices. He resided in a vast, serene estate, distant from urban areas, where he dwelled solely alongside his daughter Arya. The dwelling was stunning, featuring lavish furnishings, expansive, transparent panes, and lengthy vacant corridors. Yet it seemed chilly and devoid of vitality. Alexander had endured the loss of his spouse in a rotorcraft accident 5 years prior, mere days following Arya's arrival. That catastrophe shattered a part of him internally. He opted to isolate himself from society, not seeking tranquility, but unable to confront the external realm any longer. His whole existence now revolved around Arya. She represented the sole individual he genuinely cherished, and he endeavored maximally to supply her with all essentials. However, Arya's state complicated matters. Since infancy, medical professionals declared her sightless. Alexander faulted himself, and his routine days brimmed with subdued patterns, sorrow, and perpetual anxiety regarding her prospects. In spite of the estate overflowing with diverse opulences and aids designed for assistance, Arya appeared unresponsive to nearly everything. Alexander had engaged counselors, educators, and even summoned authorities from global locations, yearning for somebody to connect with her. Yet no alteration occurred. Arya seldom verbalized. She refrained from amusement. She abstained from giggling. The majority of her hours passed in solitary positioning, frequently beside the expansive parlor pane, sensing the wind and attending to remote noises. Her gaze, despite its sightlessness, perpetually fixed upon nothingness, never concentrating on any item. It resembled inhabiting her personal realm, inaccessible to outsiders. Alexander frequently positioned himself opposite in the space, mutely observing her, experiencing powerlessness. He recited to her at times, narrated tales, even activated tunes, but she seldom responded. Merely occasionally, she might incline her head or furrow her brow faintly, and those minor indications constituted his soul anchors. He pondered endlessly whether she recognized his identity or sensed any emotion whatsoever. At 42 years of age, Alexander appeared more aged than his chronology. The melancholy had exacted a price upon him. His facial hair grayed progressively, and his vision seemed weary predominantly. Gestures were deliberate, reflective, akin to bearing an enduring burden. He had distanced himself from acquaintances, annulled gatherings, and delegated additional commercial obligations to subordinates. He found it impossible to depart from Arya extendedly. Each dawn he adhered to a rigid schedule. He assisted Arya in attiring, prepared morning meals, and directed her across the hours. He experimented with varied approaches to bond with her, varying surfaces, aromas, melodies, but none succeeded. He experienced instances of frustration, attributing blame to destiny, healers, or his own self. He frequently regarded Arya and murmured regrets as though she might perceive the remorse within his core. Despite possessing vast resources and expertise, he proved unable to mend what he perceived as his life's paramount shortcoming, his child's suffering and muteness. The personnel within the estate numbered few and maintained discretion. They honored Alexander's seclusion and interacted minimally unless required. Most had served there for extended periods, witnessing Arya's maturation with scant variation. They conversed softly between themselves concerning her, exchanging anecdotes about minor observations. such as her occasional gentle humming during nocturnal hours, or her extending toward the identical plush plaything each dusk. Yet to Alexander, those instances resembled minuscule droplets within an arid basin. He desired greater. He yearned for her to converse, to grin, to demonstrate authentic presence. Occasionally, he positioned himself beside her and merely vocalized, recounting his daily events, recollections of her parent, or even depicting external occurrences. He anticipated some utterance might elicit a reply. However, Arya persisted largely mute, solely inclining or marginally rotating her head intermittently. Alexander grasped those indicators. Aspiring, they signified deeper import than evident. The residence itself had transformed into an emblem of all Alexander had forfeited. It accommodated a household sufficiently, yet merely 2 inhabitants occupied it. Each chamber bore a reminiscence or fragment of aspiration that never materialized fully. The infant quarters remained unaltered. It retained decoration as his partner had envisioned pre-Arya's birth. Gentle hues, creature motifs, a swaying seat adjacent to the bassinet. Alexander had abstained from altering it post-incident. Sometimes he lingered there extendedly, clutching recollections he refused to release. Arya displayed no fascination toward the space. She refrained from investigation, inquiries, or even apparent comprehension of its nature. Alexander had reconciled to this peculiar, subdued existence, yet profoundly he retained belief in potential alteration. He perused each fresh research on juvenile advancement, conferred with novel physicians, and attempted innovative methods. However, every endeavor concluded in letdown. Nonetheless, he declined total surrender. Thus the days persisted, languid, burdensome, and predominantly hushed. Alexander sustained devotion to Arya, despite scant slumber and infrequent serenity. He still directed her palm amid repasts, embraced her tenderly during garden strolls, and murmured nocturnal narratives with intonation laden with anguish and affection. Arya persisted quiet, her countenance displaying minimal sentiment, her stare eternally vacant and remote. Nevertheless, sporadically, she would repose her crown against his torso for mere instants. Those diminutive occurrences granted Alexander fortitude to persist. He remained ignorant of forthcoming events, but he had vowed safeguarding her, irrespective of circumstances. Within that solitary estate replete with echoes of yesteryears, Alexander Harrington navigated each day devoted to the taciturn youngster who demanded naught. His offspring Arya, who continued, seated placidly, perpetually bearing the identical void expression. Elias Thorne was 65 years of age and had lately endured one of his existence's most arduous phases. He had forfeited his infant progeny merely weeks subsequent to delivery. The healers failed to elucidate precisely the mishap, and the ensuing periods overflowed with bewilderment, grief, and hush. Elias inhabited a modest district on the town's periphery. He lacked a companion, proximate kin, and toiled sporadically to settle his expenses. He encountered the domestic service opportunity at the Harrington estate via a periodical advertisement. Whilst positioned in a thronged antechamber, he submitted his candidacy impulsively. A portion of him merely sought relocation to a novel locale, distant from the torment lingering within his lodging. The estate was serene and secluded, featuring grand barriers and extended access paths. Upon Elias's arrival for the evaluation, he sensed apprehension, yet concentration. Attired plainly, merely pristine and orderly, Alexander Harrington unlatched the entrance personally, astonishing him. He appeared grave, fatigued, and scrutinizing, yet not harsh. Alexander had evaluated numerous candidates for the domestic role beforehand. Most possessed exemplary endorsements and vocational history, yet an element invariably seemed amiss to him. Either they chattered excessively, appeared aloof, or uneasy near Arya. When Elias entered, he observed his composed stance and subdued gaze. He avoided ostentation and verbalized no more than essential. An atypical quality marked his demeanor, remained undisturbed by the residence's quietude. He surveyed respectfully, not inquisitively, but with subdued comprehension. Amid the evaluation, Alexander inquired regarding his background, and he replied distinctly, albeit concisely. He noted his articulation manner, forthright and uncomplicated, yet possessing a subtle tenderness. At one juncture, he halted and mentioned his recent bereavement of a youngster. He omitted particulars. Alexander acknowledged, inquiring not further, yet that solitary phrase altered his perception of him. He discerned in his visage a blend of torment and resilience. He avoided concealing either. Elias's inaugural shift commenced promptly. One employee provided a brief residence excursion and delineated the sanitation timetable. Alexander remained aloof, yet courteous. The estate spanned broadly with numerous chambers infrequently utilized. Elias concentrated on his labors, transitioning chambers soundlessly. Near noon, he learned he might pause briefly in the culinary area. There he initially beheld Arya, the youngster positioned placidly adjacent to a pane, clasping a diminutive pliant plaything. Her crown inclined marginally, and her countenance appeared remote, nearly expressionless. Elias lingered at the culinary portal momentarily, observing mutely. He had never witnessed a juvenile so immobile. An element about Arya affected him instantaneously. Not solely her sightlessness, but her apparent severance from surrounding elements. Elias refrained from utterance. He merely seated quietly opposite in the space and partook his respite. Even sans dialogue, he sensed an anomaly in that youngster. It transcended mere sightlessness. It embodied solitude. Across subsequent days, Elias sustained his endeavors meticulously. He avoided compelling dialogues or superfluous queries. He sanitized, arranged, and adhered to directives, yet commenced noting minor particulars about Arya. The youngster seldom acknowledged noises, yet occasionally halted and marginally rotated her crown upon Elias's entry. Once, whilst abrading the racks, Elias released a fabric. The gentle impact prompted Arya to recoil faintly. Elias expressed regret softly, despite awareness of Arya's sightlessness. Gradually, Elias discerned that Arya favored serene, consistent motions and gentle intonations. He further observed the personnel's distance from Arya, striving to evade perturbation. Elias conversely sensed an inexplicable attraction toward the youngster. He viewed Arya not as flawed or peculiar, perceived a juvenile requiring beyond mere tending. She required linkage. And Elias, burdened by his personal forfeiture, commenced sensing a subdued intent. One midday, whilst Elias creased fabrics in the corridor proximate to Arya's chamber, he detected a faint noise. It resembled a hushed melody, akin to a murmur. Intrigued, he ceased and attended. It emanated from Arya. She positioned on the flooring, not distant from her portal, intoning a motif lacking distinct harmony. Elias abstained from interference, merely seated nearby, resuming his chore. After minutes, Arya ceased intoning. Subsequently, she advanced gradually toward the corridor, her petite palms probing for the barrier. Elias arose soundlessly and extended his palm sans vocalization. Arya's palm suspended midway and lingered near Elias's. Then cautiously, Arya contacted her digits to Elias's. That instant, albeit fleeting, seemed profoundly significant. Elias refrained from utterance or weeping. He permitted Arya to clasp his palm momentarily. That mute interaction conveyed more than verbiage. It signified confidence, or at minimum, inquisitiveness. Thereafter, Elias ensured frequent passage by Arya, not to perturb, but to remain accessible. Alexander observed the alteration. Despite Elias's silence, he noted Arya's augmented motion throughout daylight hours. She no longer confined herself wholly near the pane. Occasionally, she positioned in the corridor or adjacent to the culinary where Elias labored visibly. Alexander queried Elias one twilight regarding progress, responded candidly, stating Arya evoked a lost individual, yet he sought no substitution. He merely desired assistance. Alexander delayed response. He regarded him extendedly, then inclined affirmatively. He distrusted readily, yet discerned Elias's authenticity. No compassion marked his deeds, merely subdued vigilance and sincere tending. That nocturnal post-Elias's retirement to his quarters, Alexander lingered exterior Arya's portal extendedly. He observed his offspring's slumber and noted a marginal variance in her respiration. Profounder, more tranquil. For the initial occasion and extended duration, an alteration permeated the residence. Elias's advent hadn't rectified matters, but initiated novelty. Elias was abrading the racks within Arya's chamber, proceeding leisurely and soundlessly. He invariably endeavored non-perturbation of the youngster, particularly when Arya occupied her customary nook, clasping the identical frayed ursine companion. Elias had discerned Arya's preference for quietude, or at minimum serene environs. However, that daylight, as he extended behind a timber coffer to sanitize, he abruptly halted, received a gentle murmur, nearly inaudible. Initially, he deemed it illusory. He pivoted marginally and regarded Arya. The petite youngster gently articulated her lips. Murmuring whilst embracing the ursine companion proximate to her torso, Elias inclined sufficiently to attend. Arya's intonation was deliberate and scarcely perceptible, yet authentic. She transcended mere vocalization. She articulated, albeit indistinctly. Elias maintained quietude, desiring no interruption. His vision fixed upon Arya's countenance, and an aspect of her demeanor captured Elias's focus. Sentiment resided there. The youngster wasn't solely sightless and severed. Deeper occurrences transpired subsurface. Elias gradually retreated and seated upon the petite lounger adjacent to the vanity. From that vantage, he monitored Arya Sand's inducing anxiety. As Arya persisted in soft murmuring, Elias observed an oddity. Arya's crown shifted marginally. Each instance a noise occurred, a floorboard's groan, a drape's adjustment, the remote drone of a suction device. Arya acknowledged all via subtle, precise gestures. Her audition attuned with such precision, it resembled diagramming the chamber solely via audition. Elias monitored silently, resisting precipitous deductions, yet the youngster's acknowledgments appeared excessively acute for one bereft of prior vision. Elias arose deliberately and traversed the mat.
Oh, yes.
Crown oriented toward him, pre-attaining the chamber's midpoint. The youngster refrained from utterance, yet evidently detected the motion. Elias positioned a plaything upon the flooring and prodded it gently. Arya's form adjusted anew, this occasion toward the precise locus of the noise's origin. Elias commenced tender essays. He unlatched a diminutive compartment, then secured it deliberately. He advanced lightly, then wrapped his footwear. Each occasion, Arya acknowledged. It was minor, occasionally merely a cranial twitch or a mandibular incline, yet invariably precise. Elias commenced pondering whether Arya relied solely upon audition or if additional elements prevailed. He resolved to essay playthings. Some featured auditory triggers, others tactile variances, yet one he selected possessed luminous indicators. He activated it and directed toward the barrier inadvertently. Arya remained unresponsive. That aligned, he contemplated. Arya remained sightless after all. However, subsequently Elias extracted his communicator to verify chronology and inadvertently activated the illuminator. The ray traversed anterior to Arya's countenance for a solitary instant. In that juncture, Elias believed he perceived motion. Arya's lids quivered. Her irises adjusted marginally, was swift and subdued, yet transpired. Elias's cardiac rhythm accelerated, and he immobilized, scrutinizing intently, uncertain of the observation. Elias deactivated the illuminator and anticipated momentarily. Then he reactivated it and gently oscillated his communicator, laterally anterior to Arya's countenance. The youngster refrained from cranial motion, yet her vision flickered anew as though pursuing an entity. It lacked intensity or concentration, yet existed, a form of acknowledgement. Elias advanced marginally nearer and reiterated the gesture. Arya's demeanor unaltered, yet her vision shifted marginally anew, tracing the ray's trajectory for an instant. Elias retreated and reseated, bewildered and astonished. Might Arya genuinely perceive an element, even minimally luminous? He lacked medical credentials, yet this deviated from complete sightlessness's response. It defied logic. The healers had declared Arya utterly sightless from inception. Elias contemplated intensely. Perhaps a reflexive action, perhaps mere fortuity. However, he had coexisted with Arya sufficiently to differentiate fortuity from acknowledgement, and this seemed authentic. Abrupt frigidity coursed through Elias's form. He regarded Arya, now repositioned placidly, gently abrading her digits across the ursine's auditory appendage. The youngster appeared serene and oblivious to the recent occurrence. Elias remained ignorant of appropriate action. Ought he inform Alexander promptly? Ought he anticipate and reassay subsequently for certainty? Numerous cogitations traversed his psyche. He desired no false optimism, yet concurrently he couldn't disregard the sighting. It transcended intuition. It embodied motion, acknowledgement, an unprecedented event. Elias deactivated his illuminator and secured the communicator within his satchel. He seated quietly and merely monitored Arya, for additional minutes. The petite youngster recommenced, murmuring, embracing her ursine companion proximally, her lips articulating deliberately. Elias lingered immobile and mute, sensing a peculiar amalgamation of trepidation, inquisitiveness, and another sentiment: optimism. For the inaugural occasion, novelty seemed feasible, unanticipated by all. As the chamber quieted further, Elias concluded sanitizing the final nook adjacent to Arya's literature rack. His cognition raced, endeavoring comprehension of the recent sighting. He regarded Arya once more, pre-departing the chamber. The youngster now occupied the identical stance, embracing the ursine companion and murmuring softly to herself. Elias monitored extendedly, immobilized in reflection. He avoided presumption yet an alteration transpired that daylight. Something pivotal. Whether luminous, motional, or mere acknowledgement, it sufficed to compel Elias to pause and sense a scintilla of potentiality. He delicately secured the portal behind him and traversed the corridor, devising subsequent measures. Perhaps reassay tomorrow with alternative luminescence. Perhaps confer with Alexander, cautiously sans inducing alarm, yet presently he retained it privately. Back within Arya's chamber, the youngster seated immobile, embracing her ursine and murmuring verbiage solely she perceived, whilst Elias clung to the transient instant. Elias couldn't expel the illuminator incident from his cognition. He had witnessed Arya's vision shift, not singularly, but dually. The gestures were marginal, yet present. It contradicted the relayed condition narrative. The youngster supposedly utterly sightless since inception. That constituted the healer's assertion. That embodied Alexander's conviction. However, Elias had observed divergence, and now required deeper knowledge. Subsequent dawn, post-customary labors. He re-entered Arya's chamber whilst the youngster occupied her habitual locus upon the pliant mat adjacent to the pane. Elias behaved nonchalantly, abrading proximate racks, creasing a coverlet, navigating routinely. Then, sans noise, he gradually propelled the pane ajar minimally. A zephyr infiltrated the chamber. Nothing potent, merely a luminous atmospheric and brilliance variance. Arya rotated her crown marginally toward that orientation, not abruptly, yet affirmatively. Elias immobilized. That lacked auditory or tactile basis. It constituted luminous or proximate acknowledgement. Later that daylight, Elias essayed another minor trial. He anticipated until Arya positioned serenely in the corridor, embracing her ursine companion routinely. Elias seized his communicator anew and activated the illuminator, feigning cabinet adjustment. Then he deliberately maneuvered his palm reciprocally betwixt the luminescence and Arya's countenance, projecting distinct umbrae. He reiterated severally, ensuring noise absence or abrupt motion. Arya delayed initial acknowledgement, yet post-seconds, her vision pursued an umbra. It was a minor gesture, nearly reflexive. Elias reiterated meticulously, more deliberately this occasion. Again, Arya's gaze adjusted scarcely, yet did. Elias's cardiac rhythm accelerated. This transcended happenstance. A linkage existed betwixt Arya's vision and luminous variances. It lacked concentrated sight, yet transcended nullity. Elias receded across the corridor subsequently and inscribed all observations. He desired chronicling each assay, each acknowledgement. The ensuing days brimmed with additional subdued trials. Elias never verbalized his actions to others, avoided alarming Alexander or implying boundary transgression. However profoundly, he believed anomaly prevailed. He sustained cautious response as upon Arya. Deliberate, luminous pulses, swift motions, brilliance alterations, and Arya acknowledged marginally each occasion. These acknowledgments lacked potency or uniformity, yet recurred. That sufficed to persuade Elias of non-imagination. One midday, whilst arranging lavatory receptacles, Elias observed a timber container positioned behind linens. Intrigued, he withdrew it. Within resided multiple diminutive phials of ocular fluids, inscriptions partially detached. Yet he deciphered the healer's designation, an antiquated, unfamiliar title. Each phial bore chronologies regressing years. No explicit directives, no rationale enumerated, solely the quantity, evidently employed extendedly, perhaps diurnal. Elias re-verified chronologies. Anomaly permeated. Extracted one file and scrutinized closely. It deviated from conventional hypersensitivity or desiccation fluid he previously encountered. Unrecognized scholarly terminology appeared. He discreetly queried the medicament's title upon his communicator absent observers, and the discovery churned his viscera. The substance employed in ocular tension mitigation, yet reportedly in infrequent instances, influenced iris acknowledgement and even luminous acuity if administered chronically, particularly in juveniles. No data regarding Aria's utilization, rationale, or necessity. Elias commenced pondering potential error, or worse, Aria's erroneous assessment. Might the fluids have obstructed innate sight extendedly? Elias lacked response yet affirmed abnormality. He repositioned the files precisely and inscribed all sightings. His apprehension augmented alongside inquiries. That nocturnal Elias reclined pondering action. He avoided accusation. Perhaps legitimate medicinal basis for the ocular fluids. Perhaps the healer possessed strategy. However, if Aria genuinely perceived luminescence or umbry, even marginally disclosure necessitated, Elias contemplated informing Alexander, yet wavered. He remained vigilant and safeguarding. He confided in prior healers and Aria's evaluation. Introducing Sand's evidence might induce friction. Still, secrecy felt erroneous. Aria merited comprehension. She merited authentic opportunity. The assensed amplified accountability toward her, augmented linkage to her advancement in veracity. He resolved to prolong observations days further, maintaining meticulous inscriptions. Then determine Alexander approach. However, in his core, he already discerned. Oversight transpired. Something pivotal. Aria's acknowledgments lacked randomness. They constituted indicators, and Elias required persistent pursuit irrespective of complexity. In ensuing days, Elias sustained normalcy around Alexander and personnel, yet his focus remained upon Aria. He vigilantly monitored each reactive instant to luminescence or motion. He reiterated subdued assays, altering solely one element sequentially, akin to an article's behavioral scrutiny. Each Aria's marginal response prompted inscription. He assayed varied diurnal periods, chambers, and luminous origins, and nearly invariably Aria acknowledged, scarcely, yet distinctly. Elias further monitored the receptacle housing, the ocular fluids. Each dawn, an elder employee transported them to Aria's chamber and administered Sand's elaboration. Elias inscribed the pattern. Aria refrained from resistance. She accustomed thereto. However, Elias couldn't disregard escalating suspicion. If these fluids constituted the issue, interrogation necessitated. He remained ignorant of Alexander's introduction, yet the notion of overt concealment all along rendered disregard impossible. A mute alert activated. Elias had anticipated sufficiently. Post days of tacit assays and inscriptions, and post Aria's reactive observation to diverse luminescence and motion variance, he sensed preparedness for ultimate measure. The subdued skepticism originating as transient reflection had augmented to magnitude an irrefutable veracity quest. He anticipated until the residents tranquilized and immobilized. Personnel concluded obligations, and Alexander retreated to his workspace for twilight. Elias located Aria positioned cross-legged upon the mat in her chamber, gently oscillating her ursine companion. The youngster appeared relaxed, her customary vacant demeanor upon her countenance. Elias seated opposite and gently withdrew a diminutive illuminator from his satchel. He regarded Aria meticulously, ensuring non-startlement. "Aria," he articulated softly, "I'm going to shine a little light. Tell me if you feel anything, okay?" Aria refrained from response, yet immobilized. Gradually, gently, Elias elevated the illuminator and directed squarely into Aria's vision, his cardiac pounding with trepidation and optimism concurrently. For seconds, nullity transpired. Aria's vision remained ajar, static, and Elias deemed potential error. However, abruptly, Aria winked. It was deliberate, nearly perplexed, and she winked anew, swifter as though acknowledging brilliance. Elias sensed his respiration ensnare in his gullet. He maintained luminous stability and inclined forward marginally. "Aria, can you feel that?" he murmured. The chamber utterly hushed, save their respiration. Aria inclined her crown, her brows contracting marginally. Then, in the minutest, most delicate intonation, she articulated something unprepared for by Elias. I think I saw a light. Daddy, the verbiage fractured and quivered, as though uncertain of propriety. Elias immobilized. He disbelieved the audition. It transcended potential sight acknowledgement. It embodied the paternal designation. Arya had never employed it previously, not singularly. Elias's vision brimmed with lacrimal fluid immediately. That solitary term fractured internally within Elias. All sustained burden since his progeny forfeiture rushed concurrently. However, now amalgamated with novelty, intent, Arya had extended in her soul-known manner. It transcended ASA. It transcended luminescence or umbri. It constituted linkage. Arya had acknowledged not solely sighted elements, but emoted sentiment in that juncture. Elias ignored whether Arya misconstrued him for her authentic parent or the term emerged inadvertently, yet immaterial. Elias inclined forward and gently positioned his palm upon Arya's scapula. "I'm here," he articulated, his intonation quivering. "You're safe," Arya refrained from withdrawal. She immobilized, then gradually inclined until her crown reposed lightly against Elias's torso. It was a minor gesture, yet for Elias it signified totality. It transcended functional assay. It initiated utter novelty, potent, authentic. Leah sustained thus for minutes, embracing Arya Sand's further utterance. He desired no moment fracture. The petite youngster, long mute, immobile, unresponsive, had articulated softly, uncertainly, yet distinctly. And it transcended content, embodied delivery. Sentiment infused her intonation, a bewilderment, hope, amalgamation, as though pursuing incomprehensible entity. Elias sensed his cardiac acceleration as his limbs gently encircled Arya. In his psyche, myriad inquiries raced. What signified this? Quantum sight might Arya possess? How extendedly had she emoted these sands' expression and the ocular fluids? Elias lacked comprehensive responses, yet possessed stronger resolution. Henceforth he discerned his function, transcended sanitization and residence tending. It embodied Arya's safeguarding, irrespective. Whatever transpired within this residence, disregard impossible. When Arya ultimately withdrew, she appeared serener, despite her countenance retaining distant aspect. Elias abraded his vision and grinned gently.
"You're very brave,"
he murmured. Arya refrained from further utterance, yet seemed more cognizant, more existent than prior. Elias meticulously deactivated the illuminator and reinserted into his satchel. His palms quivered. He recognized this defied facile Alexander elucidation, sans myriad inquiries. However, he also recognized pivotal occurrence, disregard or oblivion impossible. Elias had arrived seeking employment, evading personal mourning. However, now discovered novel intent, retention rationale. Arya transcended quiet juvenile with ailment. She embodied youngster, pursuing linkage, pursuing world incompletely experienced. Elias discerned henceforth his labor transcended domesticity. He required that linkage safeguarding. It required Arya safeguarding. As Elias arose, he gently osculated Arya's cranial apex and assisted reclining for repose. The youngster reclasped her sign proximally, yet quieted. Elias drew the coverlet over her and seated beside 4 minutes merely monitoring. His psyche overflowed with reflections, yet his core already resolved. Whatever induced Arya's sightlessness, and whatever veracity underlay those ocular fluids, or the year's hush, Elias would unearth. However, cautiously, sequentially, presently Arya had articulated, and that signified totality. It had murmured veracity in simplistic, yet profound sentence form. "I think I saw a light." Daddy, that juncture altered totality. It transcended medicament, or evaluation. It embodied confidence, security, and affection-like entity. As Elias deactivated luminaries and departed the chamber, he bore that sentence internally like vow. He would safeguard Arya irrespective of expense. Elias positioned within Arya's chamber, genuflecting beside the diminutive mat, reclasping the illuminator. He recognized risk magnitude in this. However, post-occurrence, the winking, the murmured sentence, the paternal term, cessation, impossible. Certainty necessitated. Thus he directed the luminescence gently toward Arya's vision, maneuvering deliberately to observe potential reaction recurrence. Arya winked anew identically, and rotated her crown, marginally as though pursuing brilliance. Elias sensed cardiac racing, yet pre-utterance. A resonant intonation emanated from the corridor. "What are you doing?" It was Alexander. He advanced into the chamber swiftly, his countenance crimson with ire and bewilderment. "What is that in your hand?" he vocalized. Elias immobilized, endeavoring elucidation. However, Alexander seized the illuminator from him and regarded him incredulously. "Are you experimenting with my daughter?" he interrogated severely. Realis's self-defense, Arya abruptly arose and for the inaugural occasion in existence advanced purposefully toward an individual. She advanced to Elias. Arya encircled her limbs around Ilias's midsection and clasped firmly. Her petite form quivered, and she refrained from initial utterance. Alexander utterly astonished. He had never witnessed his offspring gesture thus, never observed purposeful ambulation, let alone advancement. "Arya," he articulated, uncertain of proceedings. The youngster quieted momentarily, still clasping Elias. Then, diminutive, quivering intonation, she articulated the verbiage altering totality. "I saw a light." Alexander winked, utterly bewildered. "What did you say?" he interrogated. Arya rotated her crown marginally toward his intonation and reiterated, "I saw a light." Elias quieted, permitting the instant self-articulation. Alexander regarded both, inundated. For years he had unquestioningly believed his offspring sightless. However, now she verbalized, acknowledged, and extended toward somebody. Disregard impossible. Gradually, sans elaboration, he inclined and articulated lowly, "Stop giving her the eye drops, at least for now." Elias inclined affirmatively, his cardiac pounding with alleviation. The ensuing days overflowed with subdued alterations. Elias ceased Arya fluid administration precisely as Alexander permitted. The inaugural daylight transpired sans noticeable variance. However, by the secondary shift commenced. Arya commenced acknowledging luminescence more recurrently, particularly solar. Elias unlatched drapes during auroral hours, and Arya rotated her crown toward the brilliant pane. It transcended random motion. She paused and sustained her countenance oriented thus for minutes, nearly as though relishing the luminescence. Alexander positioned mutely at the portal that auroral, monitoring with skepticism, optimism, amalgamation. Later that midday, Elias seated with Arya employing simplistic pictorial aids, merely grand alabaster placards with ebony forms, a sphere, a quadrilateral, a triad. Gradually, he elevated each. Initially, Arya nullified. However, post-prolonged pause, she elevated her palm and indicated toward the sphere. Elias gasped quietly. Alexander, monitoring posteriorly, advanced nearer. "She saw that," he murmured. Elias inclined. It was small, but it meant something huge. It meant they were finally heading in the right direction. Each day brought something new. The progress was slow, but steady. Elias stayed consistent, working patiently with Arya through small games and simple visual tasks. Arya reacted more often now, not only to lights, but to objects. One afternoon, Elias placed 3 toys in front of her: a soft ball, a toy car, and a plastic duck. Without saying anything, he nudged the duck gently, and Arya smiled. Then she pointed at him. Alexander was nearby, and for a few seconds he said nothing. He just watched, his eyes full of surprise. "She's choosing," he said quietly. Elias nodded again. "Yes, she's seeing," that night. Arya sat with Elias by the window, and instead of just staring blankly, she began asking small questions. "What color is that?" she asked, pointing toward a blanket. It shocked them both. Elias answered softly, and Arya asked again about other things. Alexander stood near the doorway again, not saying a word. For a man who had lived with hopelessness for years, the sudden spark of progress left him speechless. He began to believe again. One morning, as sunlight filled the hallway, Arya walked toward the brightness without help. She didn't stumble or hesitate. She moved with quiet confidence, stretching her hand out toward the light coming through the window. Elias followed slowly behind her, not interrupting. Alexander had been in his office, but came out when he heard footsteps. He stopped when he saw Arya standing near the light. one hand on the glass, the other holding her teddy bear. "She's not afraid anymore," Elias said gently. Alexander didn't answer. He sat down nearby, his face pale. "I don't know how we missed it all these years," he finally said. Elias stayed quiet. Stayed. There was no easy answer. Maybe it was the wrong diagnosis. Maybe it was the medicine. Or maybe no one had paid close enough attention. But now, none of that mattered. What mattered was Aria's progress. Her smiles became more frequent. Her eyes started to look toward faces. And sometimes in quiet moments, she would reach out and touch Ilias's face like she was trying to memorize his features. By the end of the week, the atmosphere in the mansion had changed completely. It was no longer silent and heavy. It felt lighter, more alive. Aria now responded to colors, shapes, even simple gestures. She smiled more. She laughed softly when Elias tickled her or told silly stories. She had stopped whispering to herself as much and instead began asking questions out loud. Alexander, though still distant at times, started sitting with them during these moments. He no longer watched from a distance. He started participating, showing Aria's old family photo albums and asking her if she could make anything out. One afternoon, Aria squinted at a picture of her mother and asked, "Who is that lady in the red dress?" Alexander cried quietly, not from pain, but from the shock of hearing his daughter notice something visual, something real. Elias sat beside them, quietly holding Aria's hand. The journey wasn't over. There were still questions and doubts, but one thing was certain. Aria was changing. And it all began the day she said, "I saw a light." Aria's improvements had been real. They weren't her imagination, and they didn't happen by chance. Everything had changed the moment they stopped using the eye drops. That couldn't be ignored. He needed answers, real ones. So, one evening after Aria had gone to sleep, Elias took one of the small glass bottles from the cabinet where the drops were stored. He placed it in a plastic bag and hid it carefully in his purse. The next morning, while Alexander was still in a call, Elias stepped out for a few hours. He drove to a nearby city where he had arranged to meet someone from his past. His name was Samuel, an old friend from nursing school who was now doing his residency in ophthalmology. They hadn't spoken in years, but when Elias explained briefly what was going on, Samuel agreed to help. They met at a small diner near the hospital. Elias handed over the bottle, explaining everything that had happened with Aria. Samuel promised to run the tests quickly. A few days later, Elias received a call. It was Samuel, and his voice was tense. "You need to come," he said. Elias drove straight to the hospital, his stomach tight the entire time. When he arrived, Samuel brought him to a quiet office and closed the door. He held the bottle of drops in his hand and pointed to a printed lab report on the table. "These aren't normal eye drops," he began. "There's a compound in here, cyclopentellate. But in extremely high doses, this chemical causes pupil contraction and inhibits light response. In normal doses, it's used to treat certain eye conditions. But this formula is different. It's aggressive. Prolonged use, especially in children, could easily cause temporary vision loss or even convince someone that they're blind." Elias stared at the report, his heart pounding. "You're saying the drops made her blind?" Samuel nodded. "Yes. And if she was never completely blind to begin with, these drops would have erased what little sight she had." Elias felt sick. He covered his mouth and sat down, stunned. Elias asked Samuel if this kind of thing could happen by mistake. Maybe someone had mixed up prescriptions or used an outdated treatment. But Samuel shook his head. "No, this isn't a mistake. This formula was intentional. Someone designed it to restrict vision." Elias looked at the report again and froze when he saw the name printed. In the corner of the document prescribed by Dr. Victor Langford, his eyes widened. That was Aria's doctor. He had treated her since birth. Elias remembered the name from the labels on Aria's old records and medication bottles. He couldn't believe it. "How is this even allowed?" he asked. Samuel frowned. "I've heard of him. A few years ago, there were rumors about malpractice lawsuits filed against him in several states. I thought he had stopped practicing." Elias felt dizzy. If this man had knowingly prescribed medication that made Arya blind or kept her that way, then something horrible had been done. He thanked Samuel, took the report, and left the hospital. On the way back to the mansion, his hands shook at the steering wheel. That evening, Elias sat down with Alexander in his office. He placed the lab report in front of him and waited while he read it. His expression changed slowly from confusion to disbelief, and then to something darker. When he saw the name Dr. Victor Langford in bold print, he stood up abruptly and walked to the window silent for a long time. "This can't be real," he said finally. "He treated Arya since she was a newborn. He told me she had no retinal response, that her optic nerve was underdeveloped. He convinced me she would never see anything." Elias stayed calm, explaining everything Samuel had said. The chemical, the purpose, the risks. It all pointed to one conclusion. Arya had not been born completely blind, and the drops had made her condition worse. Alexander sat back down, visibly shaken. "I trusted him," he muttered. "I followed every instruction." Elias reached across the table. "You didn't know, but now we do." Alexander nodded slowly. "Then we have to find him. We have to know why he did this. First to old colleagues, then to medical offices in the state, and finally to the licensing board." Everyone gave him the same kind of answer. Dr. Victor Langford hadn't practiced medicine in years. His license had been suspended after a series of lawsuits involving other children, cases that had never made national news but were serious enough to push him out of the profession.